As an old bus took off, it enveloped Steve in a cloud of exhaust fumes, rushing away and leaving him standing at a small, unsightly stop. The man took a look around and started walking towards the house, which was 1 kilometer away. Steve hadn't been there for 8 long years, and now he didn't even try to hide his happiness, admiring the straight rows of fir and pine trees growing on both sides of the road. Steve hadn't been home for so long because he was serving time for robbery in the county jail. Having been released, he decided to leave his criminal past behind and return to his hometown. The closer Steve got to his home, the quicker he went, hurrying to give his mother a hug. He deliberately did not tell her the exact date of his release, intending to surprise the old woman. Finally, the painfully familiar house and well-maintained green lawn came into sight. As he knocked on the door, Steve heard the old lady's shuffling footsteps and a soft cough in response. A minute later, Mrs. Anderson opened the door. Unsure if she could trust her eyes, she propped her glasses to get a better look at the guest. "Steve, you're finally back. Why didn't you tell me you were coming? I would have cooked your favorite casserole," the old woman said, hugging her son who had lost weight during his years of imprisonment. After walking Steve to his room, the old woman began to fuss about the kitchen, wanting to treat her son to something tasty. The man showered and changed clothes, which he thought would remind him of his time in prison. Sitting at the table, devouring a delicious omelet, Steve told his mother that he was done with the criminal life and was going to get a job. Mrs. Anderson didn't take her son's words seriously at first. The old woman remembered all too well how Steve said the exact same thing every time he came home from prison. Unfortunately, things didn't usually go beyond these conversations, and Steve soon got back to his criminal life. However, when Steve got up early the next day and went out job hunting, the woman realized that he might be serious this time. Unfortunately, despite the good reference from the prison administration, no one wanted to hire the former convict. Tired of getting rejections and fake promises to get called back tomorrow, Steve was giving in to despair and depression. With great difficulty, he finally managed to get a job at a sawmill, which was owned by his former classmate, Frank Dawson. However, after working for a month in the difficult, inhumane conditions, Steve learned the hard way that Frank wasn't a good person. He fired Steve under false pretenses the day before he was supposed to get paid. Penniless, Steve came home and locked himself in his room. He hasn't once touched alcohol since his release from prison, but living through this kind of injustice at work tipped him over the edge. Steve drank for several days, until finally, Mrs. Anderson had a heart-to-heart with him and urged him to pull himself together. The woman's heart was breaking at the sight of her son's suffering, and so she advised him to go to the Sunday service at church and talk to the priest. The man had never been to a service before, so he was skeptical about his mother's proposal. However, when Sunday came, Steve set aside his convictions and went to church. The man stood aside during the service so as to not attract attention to himself and not to disturb the other parishioners. The fact was that Steve was ashamed to admit that he didn't know a single prayer and didn't want to stand out. After the service, the priest approached Steve and asked what was bothering him and if he wanted to talk about it. The man looked hopeful at Mr. Brown and told him about his problems with the law and his dark past. Then, embarrassed by his own candor, Steve added that he didn't know how to live on. After listening attentively to what Steve had to say, the priest took him by the hand and led him to the church's backyard, where there was a cemetery about 100 meters away. It's never too late to turn to God, Steve, and if you want to find a way to serve people, I can offer you a job at the cemetery. Steve looked closely at the straight rows of the gravestones, old and fresh, and you could see the doubts all over his face. Then, giving it a little thought, and realizing at the moment he needed work more than anything else, Steve accepted the offer. He worked at the cemetery from that day on. He had many duties, so the man didn't have time to feel bored. Steve restored tombstones, maintained lawns, and assisted gravediggers in burying the dead. Mr. Brown gave Steve his old pickup truck, so that the man could get around town and run errands quicker and easier. Steve worked diligently and selflessly, and thus managed to achieve the respect and financial stability he had dreamed of all his life. Once, the man was sitting on a bench by the old chapel during lunchtime and eating sandwiches his mother made him. Suddenly, trying to fish out another sandwich from the bag, Steve was surprised to find out that it was empty. Wondering where his lunch might have disappeared to, the man looked around, getting up from the bench. He looked around the corner of the chapel and saw the tiny thief who was happily devouring the delicious treat. The thief turned out to be a little white puppy of an unknown breed. The puppy didn't seem the least bit fazed by the man and went on with its meal. Steve gently touched the animal with his hand and couldn't help smiling at the sight of the puppy, wagging its small tail and grumbling softly in response. The man, who had dreamed of having a dog all his life, decided to take the puppy home. He realized that it would probably die if he left it on the street, and he simply couldn't let that happen. He picked up the animal and put it on the front seat of his pickup truck, and they went home. As per usual, Mrs. Anderson was waiting for her son on the doorstep to give him a hug and a kiss on the cheek. But today, instead of the regular ritual, she looked at the little puppy in disbelief, saying, "Son, why did you take in this poor fellow? He's so weak and skinny." But Steve just smiled at her and said that Charlie was going to live with them. The man named the puppy Charlie in honor of his childhood friend, who drowned while swimming in the river. At first, the puppy and Mrs. Anderson were wary of each other, feigning friendship only when Steve got home from work. However, time passed and Charlie slowly won over the heart of the elderly woman, keeping her company while she was waiting for her son. They cooked delicious pancakes and took care of the lawn together, watched soap operas, and otherwise enjoyed each other's company. Over time, Charlie grew into a really handsome, lean, and strong dog who was the envy of Mrs. Anderson's neighbors and guests. Steve just chuckled watching his mom and Charlie become best friends. Now he didn't have to worry about leaving the old woman alone, knowing that such a defender lived in the house. One day, while Steve was at work, 2 armed robbers broke into Mrs. Anderson's house. Shouting and waving a gun, the tall, red-haired robber demanded money and valuables. The old woman screamed in fright and covered her eyes with her hands. At that moment, Charlie rushed to attack the second robber, latching onto his leg. The red-haired criminal aimed his gun, and a moment later, the neighborhood heard the sound of a shot. At the same time, the dog howled, and one of the robbers screamed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Anderson ran out onto the street and started screaming for help. This turned out to be unnecessary, since the neighbors were already rushing to the Andersons' house, armed with all kinds of things, from hammers to baseball bats. It was all over soon, and the robbers, who'd taken quite a beating, were handed over to the police officers who had arrived at the call. Mrs. Anderson was in shock and required medical attention, and after the initial exam, it was decided to hospitalize the old woman to further monitor her condition. Steve was informed of the attack and rushed home. When he came into the house, all he found was Charlie, bleeding in the living room. The robber's bullet wounded the dog, dyeing his snow-white fur scarlet. The pet was barely breathing, and his eyes were already covered with a veil, foreshadowing a quick death. Taking Charlie in his arms, Steve placed him carefully on the front seat of his pickup truck. Then, honking desperately, he hit the gas and sped to the vet clinic. Charlie was running out of time. When Steve brought the half-dead dog into the operating room, the vet wasn't even sure if Charlie could survive the surgery. Sitting in the waiting room, Steve cried, praying to God for his dog to live. Fortunately, Charlie did survive the surgery safely, but the vet's prognosis still wasn't good. "If the dog survives, he'll never be able to walk," the man said, and looked away. When Steve came to visit Mrs. Anderson at the hospital, all that the old woman wanted to do was go home and find out how Charlie was doing. The man kept his answers brief, only saying that the dog was all right, all the while being surprised by his own lies. Charlie ended up being released from the clinic a couple of days before Mrs. Anderson got home. Unfortunately, the veterinarian's prognosis was accurate, and the dog remained almost completely paralyzed. He could stand up, but after taking a step or two, He fell down exhausted, whining and squealing pitifully. Charlie seemed to understand his position all too well, so he stopped eating and drinking, unwilling to go to the bathroom indoors. When Mrs. Anderson came home from the hospital, the first thing the woman did was call for Charlie, standing on the lawn holding a dog treat in her hand. "Charlie, Charlie, come here, my boy." Steve stood in silence, knowing that Charlie would never be able to go outside to greet his owner, confined to his mat by the window. Suddenly, the door creaked, barely audible, and the dog appeared on the threshold. Staggering from weakness, Charlie went out to greet his owner. Steve couldn't hold back his tears. He fell to his knees and cried. It was the first time in his difficult life that he saw such selfless loyalty, which many times only pets are capable of.